The studio courtroom fell into a reverent, almost sacred silence as Pastor Joel Osteen leaned forward at his gleaming pulpit-like desk. His trademark smile, perfectly framed under designer lights, cut through the theatrical glow of his nationally syndicated Faith in Focus program. The set, lined in soft golds and cream whites, was designed to inspire awe, yet tonight it radiated something colder: control. Across from him sat Jonathan Roumie, not in costume, not portraying a biblical figure, just a man, calm, centered. Wearing a simple navy suit and a wooden cross around his neck, his eyes held the kind of peace that unsettles the unprepared. What the audience of nearly 200 didn't know, many of them longtime followers of Osteen who'd flown in just to see their favorite televangelist live, was that they were about to witness something very different from the usual format. They expected a polite conversation about faith in modern culture, maybe some surface-level disagreements, followed by inspirational platitudes. Instead, they were about to witness a confrontation that would shake the foundation of performative religion. "Mr. Roumie," Osteen began, his voice coated in honey but edged with condescension. "You say you're here to talk about authentic faith, yet your influence comes from playing Jesus, not preaching him. So tell us, are you here to speak truth or simply to perform another role?" A few audience members chuckled nervously. This wasn't what they'd come for. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He simply looked at Osteen, then to the crowd, and finally back to the cameras as if speaking to someone far beyond the room. He smiled, not the smile of a man cornered, but of a man who had walked into the lion's den with his eyes wide open. "Pastor Osteen," he said softly, his voice carrying like a psalm across the studio, "before we talk about authenticity, perhaps we should talk about transparency, because I brought something with me today, something I believe your viewers deserve to see." Suddenly, the studio felt tighter. The camera zoomed in. Osteen's crew shifted behind the scenes, exchanging hurried glances. His producers whispered into their headsets. Something was off. This wasn't going to script. Before we go deeper into how Jonathan Roumie unraveled the facade on live television, don't forget to like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe. Because what's coming next isn't just a conversation, it's a reckoning. This moment had been months in the making. Osteen, increasingly vocal in his distaste for what he called symbolic Christians, actors, artists, and speakers who he claimed only play faith without living it, had taken veiled shots at Roumie multiple times on his show. Comments like, "Faith isn't about scripts and stage lights," or "People are confusing fan followings with spiritual fruit." He never said Jonathan's name, but the audience knew. Osteen was branding himself as the guardian of true belief, positioning himself above those who hadn't built a megachurch or sold millions of books. Roumie, on the other hand, had remained silent. He'd been advised to issue a statement. He declined, he prayed, he waited, he prepared, because Jonathan Roumie hadn't stepped into the arena of pop theology to defend himself. He came to reveal something deeper, that true faith isn't flashy, it's forged, quietly, in silence, in obedience, and sometimes in confrontation. What made this moment so explosive wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was the collision of two worldviews, one built on glory and the other on grace. Jonathan Roumie had not risen to influence through corporate ladders, best-selling books, or flashy conferences. His path was quieter, less televised, more tested. He'd spent years in theater and film, not for fame, but for the deeper call to embody truth, grace, and suffering. Long before a camera ever captured his portrayal of Jesus, he'd been volunteering in addiction ministries, praying in silence with strangers, and walking beside those the church had forgotten. Unlike those who had inherited pulpits or platforms, Roumie had labored in the background, building trust, not an empire. He had no entourage, no PR team crafting slogans. What he had was weight, the kind that comes from carrying other people's pain with him in prayer. So when Joel Osteen had spent months on his show subtly mocking spiritual influencers who confused cinematic lighting with divine light, Jonathan had heard the message loud and clear. Osteen's references to actors who pretend holiness but have no ministry had become more frequent. And though no names were spoken, the target was obvious. And Roumie had said nothing, not because he was weak, because he was waiting. Now seated in Osteen's ornate studio, a set that resembled a sanctuary but felt more like a stage, he knew the time had come. Osteen, still playing the gracious host, leaned back with practiced calm and asked, "Jonathan, you've inspired millions playing Jesus. But what have you actually done for the kingdom outside the screen? Any real ministries? Any real transformation? Or is it just viral content?" A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was Joel's home turf. The question was surgical. But Roumie didn't blink. He leaned forward, gently, like a man who had heard this kind of challenge before, but never from someone who should have been an ally. "Pastor Osteen," Roumie began, his voice even and unhurried, "I welcome the question, and I'm happy to talk about the fruit. But before we go there, allow me to ask you something." Osteen tilted his head, curious. "When was the last time," Roumie continued, "you sat with a man in solitary confinement who said he hadn't been prayed for in 10 years? Not once? When was the last time you served communion in a rehab chapel where the wine was grape juice and the bread was broken Ritz crackers?" The room shifted. The mood changed. Osteen's smile stiffened. "I'm not trying to provoke," Jonathan said, "only to establish context, because real ministry isn't always televised. Sometimes it looks like being there when nobody else shows up." The crowd grew silent again. This was not how guests usually spoke to Joel Osteen, not on his show. But this guest wasn't selling a message. He was living one. Osteen's brow furrowed slightly as he responded, "I've been preaching the gospel since before you ever stepped onto a set. Our ministries have helped thousands, millions, through hope, inspiration, and teaching. You can't measure impact by where you sit." "I agree," Jonathan said quietly, "but you can measure it by where you stand and what you stand for when no one's watching." A quiet gasp traveled through the audience. The moment was charged. Osteen adjusted his cuffs, then pressed forward. "Let's talk specifics then. You've spoken at prayer events, done interviews, given inspiring messages. But what tangible transformation have you brought to the body of Christ? What souls have been saved through your work?" This was meant to corner him. But Roumie had not come unarmed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash documents. He simply said, "3 weeks ago, I received a letter from a death row inmate in Louisiana. He saw a scene from The Chosen. Not the performance, but the prayer behind it. He told me that, for the first time in 22 years, he believed God might still want him." He paused. "He's asked for a priest. He's asked to reconcile with his daughter. That's not my doing, Pastor. That's grace. But I was willing to be a vessel." There was no comeback for that. Joel Osteen shifted in his seat, and somewhere off camera, a stage manager whispered, "This wasn't supposed to go like this." Because unlike a studio pulpit, real ministry isn't built on branding, Roumie continued quietly. It's built on breaking bread with the broken, on sitting beside the addict, the prisoner, the forgotten. That's something you might understand, Pastor, if you spent more time in the margins instead of criticizing those of us who actually serve there. The tension surged again. Joel Osteen's staff behind the cameras fidgeted. This wasn't their usual rhythm. This wasn't supposed to be a confrontation. It was supposed to be a showcase. But Roumie had come with something more powerful than charisma. He had truth. Joel's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, as if returning to a more familiar posture of control. "All right, Jonathan," he said, his voice now tinged with something less polished. "Let's talk specifics then. This ministry outreach you've been so vocal about on social media, prison visits, grassroots discipleship, all of it, it's been talked about for months. Yet we see no big campaigns, no large-scale funding. Meanwhile, souls are still lost, families still broken. Doesn't that make it performance without progress?" Some in the audience nodded. Joel sounded reasonable, grounded in results. But Roumie didn't flinch. He waited a beat, then said softly, "Well, since you brought that up, I think it's only fair to share something with your audience, something they may not have seen in your sermons." He reached down beside his chair and lifted a folder. Simple, unadorned, thick. He didn't hold it like a prop. He held it like a testimony. "3 weeks ago," Roumie said evenly, "your ministry's media company signed a $2.3 million contract with Zion Reach Holdings, a firm whose parent company runs several privately owned detention centers across the South. The same company that lobbies against prison reform and profits from keeping families apart." The studio gasped. Osteen's face twitched, the smoothness cracking just slightly. "That's not public knowledge," he said, trying to recover his composure. Roumie's voice stayed gentle, but firm. "Actually, it is. Public record. Signed it the same week you launched your national speaking tour criticizing radical mercy movements in the church." Audience members shifted in their seats. Camera operators moved closer. The control room erupted in whispered chaos, producers debating whether to cut to commercial. But the ratings were climbing too fast to interrupt. Jonathan opened the folder with the quiet precision of someone who had prepared for this moment down to the breath. Here it is, he kid, showing the front page. Consulting and content production services, 2.3 million. And here, he flipped another page, is an internal email from Zion Reach's communications director, thanking your executive producer for helping reframe the public's emotional response to criminal justice through faith-based media. Osteen stood up abruptly, his voice rising. How dare you come on my program and accuse me of this? You don't know the full picture. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached for a second document. I do, actually. I made sure I did my homework before ever stepping onto this stage. By now, phones had been pulled out across the audience. Social media feeds were already lighting up with screenshots, hashtags, and captions. Roumie confronts Osteen, truth versus performance. Is this the end of the brand? Joel was no longer smiling. He gripped the edge of his desk, and for the first time in his televised career, he looked unprepared. Jonathan stood, not for drama, not to grandstand, but because what he was about to say could not be spoken sitting down. He walked slowly toward Osteen's desk, the soft thud of his footsteps punctuated by breathless silence. You asked me what I've accomplished, he said, his voice low but unmistakably commanding. Before I answer, I think this room deserves to understand why you're asking. The lights in the studio seemed to dim, though no one touched the controls. Jonathan lifted the folder, held it before the cameras, and said calmly, this isn't about doctrine, it's not about style. It's about whether we still recognize the difference between a preacher of hope and a salesman of comfort. And just like that, the power shifted. Osteen said nothing. He couldn't, because the next thing Roumie held up wasn't another contract. It was a photograph, a grainy image of a holding cell, a boy no older than 15, curled up on a bench with a Bible clutched to his chest. The boy in this photo, Jonathan said quietly, wrote to me last month. He said one of your sermons was playing on the television in his cell. He said it made him feel worse, not because of what you said, but because he thought God had forgotten about people like him. A long silence. Jonathan set the photo down with reverence, like it was holy. And I wrote him back, not with promises of breakthrough or success, just with presence, just with prayer. And last week I baptized him through a glass wall. The audience was weeping now. No one clapped. It was too sacred for that. You've built your empire on the language of grace, Roumie said, his voice barely above a whisper. But somewhere along the way, you stopped listening to the groaning of the saints. Jonathan opened the folder and gently pulled out a document, holding it up so the cameras and the crowd could see it clearly. This, he said solemnly, is a contract between your media ministry, Radiant Light Productions, and Zion Reach Holdings, one of the largest for-profit correctional contractors in the United States. 2.3 million over 3 years for what they call faith-based narrative consulting and content development. The crowd gasped. Some covered their mouths. Others instinctively reached for their phones. The silence was instantly broken by the sound of camera shutters and recording icons blinking red. Joel Osteen's face ran through a carousel of emotion. Confusion, indignation, then, just for a flicker, fear. That's a business contract, he protested, his usually velvet smooth voice suddenly thinner. It has nothing to do with my message or my heart for justice. Jonathan offered a quiet, almost compassionate smile. Not smug, not theatrical, but the kind of expression you give when you've been underestimated for far too long. Really? Roumie said, pulling out a second page. Because this email from Zion Reach's VP of Government Relations to your executive producer tells a very different story. Osteen began to speak. You can't just... But Roumie was already reading. Thank you for agreeing to help shift the narrative on criminal justice reform. The recent surge of grassroots compassion, especially from voices like Roumie, is threatening to destabilize our legislative leverage. Having Pastor Osteen challenge the effectiveness of these movements will be a strategic win for our long-term positioning. The studio exploded. Audience members shouted questions. Others simply sat frozen, stunned by the naked language of manipulation. Joel looked as if he'd been struck, but Jonathan wasn't finished. You questioned what I've done for the kingdom, Pastor, Roumie said, reaching once more into his briefcase. Allow me to show you. He pulled out a thick stack of printed pages. This is the Mercy Reentry Initiative, a faith-based rehabilitation framework I've co-developed with chaplains, former inmates, and trauma specialists. It's currently being piloted in 3 federal prisons. The early results show a 38% reduction in repeat offenses. Gasps again, whispers. And this, he said, lifting another paper, is the restoration code, our transparency model tying church funding to ethical accountability. It's being adopted by 7 dioceses across the country. And here, he held up one more page, is the Justice Without Profit Act. I helped write it. It's now sitting before the Senate with bipartisan support. It would sever ties between private prisons and faith-based media partnerships like yours. Osteen tried to interrupt. Those are just ideas, proposals. Anyone can propose something. You're right, Roumie said, gently cutting him off. Anyone can start something, but not everyone can get a broken system to listen. And certainly not everyone can do it without compromise. Applause erupted, not staged, not polite, but raw. Roumie raised a hand, not to celebrate, but to still the moment. Let's be clear, Pastor, he said, now walking toward the desk. While you've spent 20 years crafting sermons in front of HD cameras, I've spent my life in ordinary places. I've baptized gang members in rehab centers. I've held the hands of dying men who hadn't heard the name Jesus without a curse in decades. I've sat in broken-down trailers with families torn apart by incarceration. And I've never once taken $1 from the people who profit from their suffering. He stepped closer. You want to talk about my online following? Fine. Let's talk about how my live stream from the Phoenix Detention Center led to an official DOJ investigation into inmate mistreatment, or how my testimony before Congress helped strip corporate faith-based programming from for-profit prison contracts, or how one prayer post led to 3 executives getting indicted for misusing federal reentry funds. Joel sat back, visibly shaken. He, the man who had built his empire on asking hard questions and smiling through discomfort, now sat in stunned silence as someone finally held him accountable. Jonathan turned slowly, facing the audience and the cameras, directly. This is the sickness in our system, he said, voice strong but grieving. People build platforms, get comfortable, get rich, and forget what we were called to do in the first place. They speak about grace, but avoid sacrifice. They quote the Sermon on the Mount, but live like kings on golden hills. The room was dead silent. Even the camera crew stood still. You asked what I've accomplished, Pastor, he concluded, returning to his chair. I've done something you haven't done in 20 years of ministry. I've shown people the face of Christ without selling access to it. I've walked into places you wouldn't dare go, with nothing but a prayer in my pocket. I've helped free people, not just from prison, but from despair. And I did it without bowing to Mamo and Fun. He finally sat down, folded his hands, and smiled. Now, Pastor Osteen, he asked gently, did you have any other questions about my walk? By the time the program finished airing on the West Coast, #OsteenExposed was already trending worldwide. But it wasn't just Twitter. Once full clips hit YouTube and TikTok, beginning with Roumie calmly holding up the Zion Reach contract and ending with Osteen frozen in silence, the internet erupted. In just 24 hours, the takedown video had been viewed over 2.3 million times, becoming one of the most watched faith-based confrontations in online history. Comments flooded in from across every demographic, Catholic, evangelical, even secular audiences. I've watched Joel Osteen for a decade. I've never seen anyone turn the stage on him like that. Jonathan Roumie just reminded the world what the church is actually supposed to look like. Another viral comment read, "This is what happens when you try to perform faith in front of someone who actually lives it." Even conservative religious commentators, typically allies of Osteen, were forced to acknowledge the moment. One Baptist blogger wrote, "I don't agree with Jonathan Roumie's Catholic background or his acting career, but I can't deny this. He came prepared. He spoke the truth, and he held a mirror up to someone who's been untouchable for far too long." Mainstream media coverage didn't just echo the virality, it amplified it. CNN ran the headline, "Jonathan Roumie outshines megachurch pastor in live faith confrontation." MSNBC's Rachel Maddow dedicated an entire segment titled, "From Role to Reality, the Actor Who Became a Prophet." The New York Times published a Sunday feature, "The Business of Belief: What Roumie's Revelation Says About Faith and Finance." The Washington Post's fact-checkers went to work, confirming every document Jonathan had revealed, including the email from Zion Reach. The confirmation only deepened the blow. Even international media joined in. The BBC called the confrontation a symbol of the coming generational shift in Christian leadership. A French Catholic paper wrote, Roumie n'a pas joué Jésus ce soir-là. Il l'a incarné. Roumie did not play Jesus that night. He embodied him. But the most shocking turn came from Fox News. Tucker Carlson, not known for praising actors or Catholic mystics, said on air, I disagree with a lot of what Roumie probably believes. But I'll say this, that man stood his ground. He didn't shout, he didn't spin, he used facts, he used faith. He made a megachurch empire look very, very small. Republicans could learn something from that kind of composure. Even Sean Hannity reluctantly admitted, I think Roumie's not my kind of Christian leader, but I respect what he did. He came in with evidence, not drama. He didn't back down when someone with more fame and fortune tried to steamroll him. The damage to Joel Osteen's brand was swift and brutal. By sunrise, hashtags like #FaithForSale and #ProsperityGospelExposed were trending beside #Rue. Journalists who had once brushed off Osteen's business affiliations as standard began looking deeper. What they found was worse than anyone expected. The $2.3 million Zion Reach contract was just the beginning. Further investigations revealed that over the past 6 years, Osteen's media subsidiaries had accepted more than $9.1 million into production deals, endorsements, and consulting agreements with companies tied to the private incarceration industry, faith-based financial schemes, and even corporate redemption coaching programs targeting ex-offenders. His hometown paper, the Houston Chronicle, ran the front-page headline, The Ministry of Optics, Osteen's Empire and the Prophets of Penance. The article detailed a sprawling web of nonprofits, shell companies, and speaker fees all tied back to Osteen's brand, a brand that had positioned itself as grace-filled and untouchable. Now, that halo was cracking. Osteen tried to recover. He appeared on several talk shows in damage control mode, repeating lines like, My business dealings are separate from my faith teachings. I've always followed what God put on my heart. But the charm didn't land. On The View, Whoopi Goldberg asked him directly, Joel, you've built your entire brand on holding people up with positive words. But how do you not see that people also deserve transparency, especially when your words shape how millions understand justice and mercy? He didn't have a good answer, the sponsors noticed too. Within a week, 3 of the biggest corporate backers of Joel Osteen's broadcast ministry quietly pulled their support, citing ethical concerns and lack of transparency regarding financial entanglements. For years, the ratings of Faith in Focus had been slowly slipping, masked by polished stagecraft and celebrity endorsements. But after the Roumie confrontation, viewership plummeted by 30%, a cliff drop that no amount of branding could disguise. While Joel's empire reeled, Jonathan Roumie's inbox overflowed. In the first 72 hours, his team reported over 50,000 messages from clergy, seminarians, recovering addicts, prison chaplains, and ordinary believers. Over 90% expressed profound support, many calling the moment a spiritual awakening or the confrontation the church desperately needed. Donations surged to the Mercy Reentry Initiative, the grassroots program Roumie had quietly co-founded years earlier. More importantly, doors that had long been shut began to open. Catholic dioceses, evangelical networks, and even interfaith prison reform groups reached out, seeking his counsel. 2 Protestant denominations officially adopted elements of Roumie's Restoration Code as part of their financial ethics standards. And the Justice Without Profit Act, once buried in committee, was now gaining bipartisan attention, with 3 new co-sponsors by the week's end. Even leaders who disagreed with him theologically couldn't deny what they had witnessed. Look, said a prominent Baptist pastor on his podcast, I don't agree with Roumie on everything, but what he did, that was conviction with spine. He came in with facts, he came in with grace, and he handled the most powerful Christian media personality in the world without flinching. That's not acting, that's ministry. The impact went far beyond Osteen's pulpit or Roumie's platform. Seminaries, divinity schools, and communications programs began analyzing the exchange in detail. It quickly became a case study in the spiritual leadership under pressure, taught not as performance, but as a model of principled courage. Harvard Divinity School and Notre Dame's Kroc Institute both added the full transcript to their curricula. A course at Yale's School of Sacred Media began using the clip to teach the ethics of public witness in faith broadcasting. On the Liturgist podcast, theologian and writer Mike McHargue called it not just a media moment, but a sacramental act of truth-telling, grace under fire. Even political strategist James Carville not a faith leader by any stretch, weighed in on his show. Osteen tried to use his power, experience, and aura to knock Roumie off balance. But Roumie flipped him. He made Osteen's aura look like ego. That wasn't acting. That was theological jujitsu. Roumie's confrontation didn't just expose one man's contradictions. It lit a match in the dark corners of faith media. In the weeks that followed, multiple televangelists and Christian commentators were forced to disclose their financial partnerships, especially with corporations that profited from incarceration, healthcare debt, or predatory faith-based programs. Major networks introduced new transparency standards. The Evangelical Press Association updated its ethics charter to include clear language on corporate influence. And the Society of Christian Broadcasters released a joint statement admitting that Roumie's moment had sparked an overdue reckoning. For younger spiritual leaders, especially those from underrepresented communities, Jonathan Roumie became something more than an actor. He became a blueprint, a quiet, reverent counterexample to the showmanship that had come to define so much of modern ministry. As Rapper Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wrote in a now-viral tweet, "Sometimes the most prophetic thing you can do is stay calm and speak the truth, especially when truth makes people squirm." Roumie showed that the new voice of leadership isn't loud, it's deeply rooted. What the world saw that night wasn't a performance, it was presence. And for anyone still watching, one message rose above the noise. If you build your platform on appearance, one moment of truth can unravel it. But if you build your life on truth, no platform can contain it. If you believe that truth should be spoken with grace and that quiet conviction is more powerful than polished performance, then this is just the beginning. We're telling the stories others are too afraid to touch, and we're doing it with reverence, preparation, and fire. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next reckoning, revelation, or moment of clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful voice in the room, is the one that doesn't raise itself, but raises the standard. Join us. Share us.